at a small airport in Nevada. The scorching sun beats down, heat rising from the shimmering tarmac. A high-end business jet is grounded, unable to take off. An unknown error has caused a 2-hour delay. The elite technical team has checked everything multiple times, but found nothing. In the distance, a man approaches, oil-stained shirt, a weathered toolkit in hand. Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old freelance mechanic. He was called at the last minute because they were short-staffed. Engineers whisper, "We're really calling him for this?" Daniel ignores the noise. He says, "Run the system again, but don't reset anything. Watch. Truth is here." Daniel Brooks was a man of steel, silence, and absolute rhythmic precision. At 41, his face was a map of honest labor, etched with the subtle lines of a man who preferred the cold, logical hum of a turbine engine to the shallow, echoing chatter of a corporate office. He was a freelance maintenance technician, a ghost mechanic who moved from one small airfield to another, taking the dirty jobs that no one else wanted. He was the man who understood the language of fatigue in both machines and men. He didn't have a prestigious degree from an Ivy League university hanging on a mahogany wall. He didn't have a corporate ID that granted him access to the climate-controlled executive lounge. He had a heavy, dented steel box filled with tools that were older than the junior engineers currently mocking him. Daniel's life was a masterpiece of managed struggle and quiet sacrifice. 5 years ago, his world had been surgically hollowed out when his wife, Sarah, passed away after a brave battle with illness. Since that day, he had systematically dismantled his old high-pressure life as a top-tier aerospace designer to ensure he could be the absolute anchor for his 9-year-old son, Ethan. Daniel was a man who had once been on the path to a global VP role, but he walked away from the 80-hour weeks and the soul-crushing international travel. He needed to be the father who was there for the science projects, the bad dreams, and the Saturday morning pancakes. He chose the flexible, often unstable life of a freelance contractor because his son's presence was a currency that no stock option or six-figure salary could ever replace. Ethan was his shadow and his reason for being. On days when school was out, the boy would sit in the technical break room of whatever hangar Daniel was working in, clutching a sketchbook. Ethan knew his dad was special. He saw the way Daniel could listen to a car engine and tell you exactly which spark plug was misfiring just by the frequency of the vibration. To the rest of the world, Daniel was just a struggling mechanic in a faded uniform who rode a bike to the hangar. To Ethan, he was a hero who held the world together with a wrench, a flashlight, and a quiet smile. On this particular afternoon, the Nevada desert was a furnace, and the air shimmered with the smell of sagebrush and high-octane jet fuel. A sleek business jet, a multi-million-dollar asset belonging to a high-profile technology conglomerate, was paralyzed on the primary runway. The on-site engineering team, men in crisp, monogrammed white shirts carrying expensive diagnostic tablets, were in a state of clinical panic. They had been troubleshooting a phantom error in the flight control logic for over 2 hours. Their diagnostic computers were giving them green across the board, yet the aircraft refused to clear the pre-flight safety handshake. Every minute the jet sat idle cost the firm $10,000, and the pressure from New York was reaching a boiling point. When Daniel arrived, the contrast was jarring and almost comical. He looked like he had just finished repairing a rusty tractor in a dust storm. He walked past the shiny service trucks, his heavy work boots sounding solid and grounding on the hot tarmac. He didn't offer a handshake or a long explanation of his background. He didn't try to impress them with technical jargon. He simply stood at the edge of the port wing, watching the team run their automated tests for the 6th time. He wasn't looking at the screens. He was looking at the way the control surfaces moved or failed to move at the microscopic level. One of the lead engineers, a man named Marcus, who prided himself on his digital-first philosophy, looked at Daniel with visible contempt. "We've got the best diagnostic software in the industry running here, pal. We spent months training on this specific airframe. If the AI can't find it, a socket wrench isn't going to help. You're just here to help us move the heavy equipment once we figure out which module to swap." Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't get angry or defensive. He had spent years being underestimated, It was his favorite form of camouflage. He waited for the next diagnostic cycle to end, and then he spoke with a low, steady rumble that seemed to cut through the high-pitched whine of the cooling fans. "Run the system one more time," Daniel said, his voice carrying a calm authority. "But this time, don't reset anything. Don't clear the cache. Don't perform a factory handshake to clean the logs. Just let the machine breathe on its own terms. Let it show you the fever it's actually carrying." Marcus scoffed, his face turning a shade of red that matched the warning lights on his tablet. "We've done that already. Standard operating procedure is to clear the logs to see if the error replicates. That's how modern systems work, Brooks. We don't have time for gut feelings." Daniel shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the jet's tail assembly. "Not like this. You're clearing the evidence before you understand the crime. You're looking for a mountain on your screens, but I think you're tripping over a pebble in the dirt. Let it run raw, or you'll never see the ghost." In the real world, the person with the most valuable answer is often the one we choose to ignore, because they don't fit the image of success. We measure intelligence by rank and titles, forgetting that true mastery is earned in the dirt of experience, not the comfort of a classroom. Position doesn't reflect ability. It only reflects the chair you're sitting in. The silence in the hangar was heavy, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic whine of a far-off turbine and the occasional snap of cooling metal. Marcus, the lead engineer, eventually sighed and gestured toward the cockpit with a frustrated flick of his wrist. "Fine. It's your time we're wasting. Run the cycle, no reset. Let's see what this mechanical intuition looks like in the age of fiber optics." Daniel didn't move toward the controls or the expensive diagnostic ports. He stayed by the wing, leaning his head close to the secondary actuator housing, his eyes closed. As the systems whirred to life, a symphony of electronic clicks and hydraulic groans filled the space. On the monitors, the data began to scroll, a waterfall of green code that looked to any observer like absolute perfection. It was a digital lie, polished and smooth for the convenience of the observers. "See?" Marcus said, tapping his screen with a triumphant grin. "Everything is nominal, no flags, no conflicts. The logic gates are firing exactly as programmed. It's a ghost in the machine, Brooks. We probably have a faulty sensor that needs a full hardware replacement in New York. We're wasting our time standing in the heat." Daniel didn't look at the screen. He was listening to the deeper rhythm of the jet. He noticed the way the hydraulic pump surged for a fraction of a heartbeat every 12 seconds. A micro-stutter that didn't even register as an audio event to the others. It was more of a shiver in the airframe. He saw the way the younger engineers were frantically refreshing their tablets, looking for a red light to tell them what to do. They were waiting for the computer to give them permission to think. They were lost without the dashboard. "The problem with a reset," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the mechanical hum like a knife, "is that it smooths out the edges. It forces the system back to a theoretical zero. But machines don't live at zero. They live in the friction, the heat, and the history of their own operation. By resetting, you're wiping away the stutter that only happens when the system is actually trying to work. You're silencing the witness." He pointed to a specific module tucked deep in the wing, the tertiary feedback loop for the horizontal stabilizer. "You think the error isn't displaying because it's not a major failure. I think the error isn't displaying because it's almost correct. It's a timing drift. A lag so small your software thinks it's just environmental noise, or a rounding error. But a rounding error at Mach 0.8 is a death sentence." The technicians around him began to murmur, the skepticism in the air starting to crack. One of the older mechanics, a man who had been quiet the whole morning, stepped closer, his eyes following Daniel's finger. "A timing drift on a G6? That system is triple redundant, Daniel. If one drifts, the other two pull it back in line." "Redundancy only helps if the components agree on the truth," Daniel countered, his eyes sharp and focused. "If one sensor is lying by half a millisecond, the other two spend all their energy trying to correct it without reporting it as a fault because it's still within range. They think they're doing their job, but the airframe feels the struggle. The computer is hiding the fight from you because you told it to only report total failure. Daniel stood perfectly still, performing a tactical observation, a technique he had developed over 20 years of fixing machines that were older, more temperamental, and far less forgiving than this jet. He was looking for the break in the pattern. He was waiting for the machine to reveal its secret. Marcus checked his tablet again, his brow furrowed as he looked at the raw telemetry. I don't see any lag, Daniel. The response time is 0.04 milliseconds. That's industry standard. It's perfect. It's the average, Daniel corrected, his voice dropping an octave. I don't care about the average. I care about the cycle. Look at the peak variance at the 12-second mark of the raw hex code. Don't look at the graph. Look at the numbers. Marcus scrolled through the raw data logs, his fingers moving with a new, cautious speed. He bypassed the beautiful graphical interface and went straight to the jagged hex code. He reached the 12-second mark of the last cycle. He stopped. His face went from a confident, arrogant red to a sickly shade of ash gray. Wait, there's a micro-spike, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. It's not an error code. It's an administrative handshake delay. The secondary computer is waiting for a response from a module that isn't even part of the flight sequence. It's a conversation with a ghost. The room went cold. The experts realized they had been looking for a broken part when they should have been looking for a confused mind. They had been trying to fix the hardware, unaware that the software was having a private, catastrophic conversation with a component they hadn't even checked. In modern life, our first instinct is to reset, to clear the history, delete the mistake, and start over. But sometimes the reset is just a mask for a recurring problem. You can't fix what you refuse to see, and you can't see the truth if you're always busy erasing the traces of the struggle. Truth lives in the friction, not the fresh start. The atmosphere in the hangar had shifted from mocking skepticism to a heavy, tactical focus. Marcus, the lead engineer, was no longer looking at Daniel's oil-stained clothes or his tattered sneakers. He was looking at Daniel's hands as they pointed toward a secondary routing module tucked behind the landing gear bay, a part of the plane that was usually ignored during pre-flight checks. That module? Marcus asked, his voice now stripped of its unearned arrogance. That's just the auxiliary billing and satellite comms link for the passenger Wi-Fi. It's not critical for flight operations. It doesn't even talk to the primary flight computer during the takeoff phase. It shouldn't, Daniel agreed, stepping under the massive, smooth belly of the jet. But in a system this complex, everything is connected by the same power grid and the same master timing clock. If the billing node has a dirty grounding wire or a leaking capacitor, it sends a ripple back through the master clock every time it tries to ping the satellite. It's like a runner with a tiny pebble in their shoe. It doesn't stop them from running, but eventually it changes their gait. It creates a rhythm that the rest of the body has to compensate for until something snaps. Daniel reached into his old toolkit and pulled out a simple analog multimeter, a device that looked like an ancient relic compared to the multi-thousand-dollar digital scopes the others were using. He didn't trust the digital smoothing filters of the modern equipment. They were designed to hide noise. He wanted to see the raw, jagged pulse of the electricity itself. Check the voltage on the auxiliary feedback line, Daniel directed a junior technician who moved with a new sense of urgency. Don't look at the dashboard on your tablet. Look at the copper. Look at the raw surge. As the technician placed the probes, Daniel watched the needle on his meter. It was rock steady for exactly 11 seconds. Then it gave a tiny, almost imperceptible jump. A ripple of less than 0.1 volts. A ghost in the wire. There, Daniel whispered, his eyes locked on the needle. The team gathered around, silent. To a layman, it was nothing. A flicker. To a room full of aerospace engineers, it was a heartbeat in a morgue. It was the inconsistency that Daniel had sensed before he even touched the plane. It's a backfeed, Marcus realized, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. The satellite antenna is drawing a surge every time it tries to handshake with the ground station. That surge is leaking back into the primary data bus. It's not breaking the code. It's just making the flight computer stutter for a millisecond while it resyncs. The computer thinks the flight data is corrupt because the timing is off, so it ignores the packet. That's why we're failing the safety handshake. The plane isn't broken, it's just waiting for the noise to stop. One of the senior engineers let out a long, shaky breath, wiping sweat from his brow. We would have replaced the entire flight deck, a $2 million job, before we ever looked at a $500 billing module. It's completely outside our diagnostic tree. It's not even in the manual. Daniel stepped back, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. The diagnostic tree only grows in the direction you point it, Marcus. You assume the problem had to be important because the jet is expensive. You assume the error had to be complex because your minds are complex. But physics doesn't care about the price tag or your titles. A bad ground is a bad ground, whether it's on a $100 million jet or a $10 toaster. It all follows the same laws. For the next hour, Daniel guided the elite team through the repair. He didn't take the lead in a way that humiliated them. He acted as a mentor, showing them how to feel the circuit with their eyes and ears. He taught them to look for the almost right, the sensors that were giving data that was technically within safe ranges, but lacked the crispness of a healthy system. They found the culprit, a microscopic burr of metal on a connector pin in the auxiliary bay. Likely a tiny manufacturing defect that had been vibrating loose for months. It was a 5-cent part causing a $100 million headache. It was the pebble in the shoe of a giant. As the new connector was snapped into place and the systems were powered up, for the 6th time that day, the hangar went deathly silent. No one typed. No one refreshed their screens. They all watched the main gate display at the front of the hangar. Handshake sequence initiated. Encryption verified. Primary systems, green. Secondary systems, green. Flight status, nominal. The room didn't erupt in cheers or applause. It erupted in a profound, respectful silence that felt like a prayer. The engineers looked at each other, their egos finally deflated, and then they all turned to look at the man in the faded blue jacket. He was already closing his toolkit, checking his watch with the same quiet, unshakable focus he had when he arrived. That was it, Marcus said softly, staring at the perfect green screen. That was the whole thing. A billing module Wi-Fi link. We almost grounded a fleet for a Wi-Fi surge. Daniel simply nodded, slinging his toolkit over his shoulder. Inconsistent signals are more dangerous than no signal at all. A broken machine tells you it's broken. A machine that's almost right lies to you until it's too late. Trust the rhythm, not the report. The most difficult problems in life are rarely the ones where everything is broken. The real challenges are the things that are nearly correct. The relationships that almost work, the plans that are almost solid, the truths that are almost whole. We spend our lives looking for the big break, but we usually lose the race because of a tiny, inconsistent flicker that we decided was too small to matter. The freeze moment didn't happen when the lights finally turned green. It happened 5 minutes later, when Daniel Brooks began walking toward the hangar exit and the most powerful man in the building, the CEO of the airline, who had been watching the entire drama from the soundproof glass of the observation deck, stepped onto the hangar floor. The CEO, a man named Sterling, who was legendary for his ruthless efficiency and his habit of firing people for 3-minute delays, didn't walk toward his lead engineers. He didn't ask for a report. He walked straight toward Daniel. The senior staff froze in place. They expected a lecture on the 2-hour delay. They expected Daniel to be escorted off the property for interfering. Instead, they saw something they had never seen before. Sterling offered his hand to a contractor in a greasy uniform. "Where did you learn to read a routing bus like that, Daniel?" Sterling asked, his voice carrying a resonant weight that made the entire room stand at attention. "I've seen chief designers at Boeing and Lockheed miss a backfeed like that for a month. You saw it in 20 minutes without even opening a laptop. Who are you?" Daniel stopped, his heavy toolkit hanging from his shoulder. He looked at the CEO, then back at the jet, and then at the engineers who were now staring at him as if he were a ghost. He realized that his camouflage of ordinariness was finally starting to slip away. "I learned it by fixing the things that people gave up on, sir," Daniel replied quietly, his voice humble but firm. "When you don't have a budget for new parts or a team of analysts, you have to learn how the old ones actually work. You have to learn to hear the difference between a mechanical grind and an electrical hum. You learn that the machine never lies, even when the software does. Marcus, the lead engineer, stepped forward, his face full of a genuine, painful shame. Mr. Sterling, we would have missed this. I was ready to authorize a ferry flight to New York with that surge still active. The system could have locked up mid-air over the Rockies. Daniel didn't just fix a delay. He saved the airframe. He saved our lives. The realization hit the room like a cold front moving through the desert. The mockery was gone. The doubt was gone. In its place was an intense, silent respect that was almost suffocating. They saw Daniel Brooks not as a struggling mechanic anymore, but as a master of a hidden world they barely understood. They realized that they had been looking at his scuffed boots and grease-stained shirt while he was looking at the future of their entire industry. Daniel didn't wait for a trophy, a bonus check, or a speech. He checked his watch again. 2:55 p.m. The school bus would be arriving at the corner in exactly 15 minutes. If the plane is true, sir, I have a mission at a local elementary school. My son is expecting a ride home, and I promised him we'd work on his model rocket today. Sterling looked at the man's name tag, then at his calm, unshakable hazel eyes. He saw the integrity of a man who knew exactly who he was. You're not just a mechanic, are you, Daniel? You're the architect we've been looking for. I'm exactly what I need to be, sir, Daniel said, offering a small, respectful nod. As Daniel walked out of the hangar and into the bright, blinding Nevada sun, the atmosphere of the airport changed forever. The nobody had become the anchor. He left behind a room full of people who finally realized that expertise doesn't always wear a suit, and sometimes the person you think is struggling is actually the only one who knows exactly where the path leads through the dark. A moment of truth doesn't need a loud explanation or a marketing campaign. It only needs a clear, undeniable result. When the green lights finally stay on, the uniform no longer matters. Respect isn't something you can demand with a title. It's something that settles on you when you're the only one in the room who can see the path when the lights go out. The following week, a black luxury sedan pulled up to the curb of the small, modest apartment complex where Daniel and Ethan lived. A representative from the airline's corporate headquarters stepped out, holding a thick, embossed leather folder. He wasn't there to fire Daniel for the delay. He was there to offer him the position of Director of Technical Integrity for the entire national fleet, a role created specifically for him. Daniel sat on his small wooden porch, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hand, watching Ethan ride his bike in the driveway. He looked at the contract, the 7-figure salary, the corporate benefits, the prestigious title that would make him one of the most powerful men in aviation. He looked at the mandatory travel clause and the 24/7 availability expectation. He handed the folder back to the representative with a faint, peaceful smile that carried no regret. I truly appreciate the offer, sir, Daniel said, his voice as steady as it had been in the hangar. It's an incredible gesture, but I already have a full-time job, and the boss is very demanding. The representative blinked, confused, looking at Daniel's humble surroundings. We checked your records, Mr. Brooks. You're a freelancer. You work for 3 different airfields on a per diem basis. This is a chance for total financial stability for the rest of your life. Why stay here? Daniel looked at Ethan, who was currently trying to balance his bike on one wheel, laughing as he wobbled. The stability I need isn't in a bank account, sir. It's in the fact that my son knows exactly where I'll be at 3 p.m. every single day. I chose the wrench because it's a tool for my life, not a cage for my soul. I'll take the contract as a remote consultant, on my own hours from my own city. But I won't trade his childhood for a title on a door. I've already lost enough time. The representative was stunned into silence. He realized then that Daniel Brooks wasn't ordinary because of his skill. He was extraordinary because of his contentment. He was a man who knew exactly what was enough. The story of the struggling mechanic and the grounded jet ended not with a promotion, a press conference, or a headline. It ended with a simple, quiet Tuesday afternoon. Daniel was back at the small airfield fixing a wooden propeller on a vintage 1940s Cessna. A local pilot walked by, tipped his hat and asked, "Hey, Daniel, I heard you're the guy who fixed that big G6 in record time last week. Why are you still here in the dust and the heat?" Daniel didn't look up from the engine. He simply tightened a brass bolt, listening for that perfect, rhythmic click that told him the metal was happy. "Because the wind is the same here as it is at 30,000 feet," Daniel replied, a small smile playing on his lips. "And because the logic is always true if you're quiet enough to hear it, I'm right where I belong." He realized then that he didn't need to prove himself to anyone. He had found the one system that was perfectly stable, a life lived with integrity, a box of honest tools, and a son who thought his dad was the smartest man in the universe. Real relationships in a real life don't start with a fairy tale or a big paycheck. They start with the courage to be real. They start when you're tired of being perfect and ready to be honest. The most beautiful lives are the ones that are a little bit messy, a little bit quiet, but entirely true to the things that matter most. True value is found in the integrity of your actions, not the labels the world gives you. Never judge a master by his uniform, for the person standing in the shadows may be the only one holding the entire foundation together. Real success is knowing when you have enough, and real power is the courage to stay true to what matters most when the world is offering you everything else. If you believe that real experience beats appearances every time, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, would you have trusted a man like Daniel at first glance? Or would you have looked at his clothes? Have you ever been overlooked because you didn't have the right title?